and welcome to today's webinar titled Human Factors Engineering, the Worldwide Guide for Medical Device Manufacturers. My name is Laura Court and I'm a medical device guru here at Greenlight Guru, and I will be your moderator for today's event. We've got a really special presentation scheduled for you today. I know our co-presenters, Bryant Foster and Anders Orns, are really looking forward to guiding you through the human factors engineering process of the top international medical device markets and showing you how to meet the varying requirements of each regulatory body. Before we dive too deep into today's presentation and introduce our presenters and their consultancy research collective, I'm going to touch on a few quick items here. So first, today's webinar is going to run for about 90 minutes in total and will include a Q&A session at the end where Bryant and Anders will answer questions submitted from our live participants. So I encourage you to submit your questions throughout the webinar in the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will get to as many as we can as time permits. We will also be sharing the full recording and slides with all registrants after the webinar, so keep an eye out on your email later today. I'd also like to share a few quick words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on these free training sessions. If you've participated in one of our training sessions before, then you know that we put on these because improving the quality of life is our mission here at Greenlight Guru, likely a similar mission as many of you tuning into now. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether that's through hosting these free training sessions or by partnering with world-class medical device consultant like today's presenters, Bryant and Anders, as well as through our award-winning quality management software. For those of you who said you are interested in learning how Greenlight Guru's software can help you establish and maintain human factors documentation for global regulatory compliance, someone from our team will be reaching out to you today after the webinar. If you haven't connected with us yet but would like to, simply head over to www.greenlight.guru after the webinar and schedule your free personalized demo. In doing so, you'll learn how the very best medical device companies are leveraging our purpose-built quality management software to meet others' needs, like market approval from FDA, compliance with EU MDR and IVDR, ISO 13485-2016 certification, as well as breeze through audits and push past baseline compliance to deliver true quality medical devices to patients. Now on to the bulk of today's presentation. Let me give a proper introduction to our co-presenters today and distinguished partners of ours at Greenlight Guru, Bryant Foster and Anders Orn. Bryant and Anders have conducted successful human factors and usability research for more than 50 medical devices, including surgical instruments, point-of-care devices, diagnostics, combination products, Class 3 implants, home use devices, OTC products, and many more. Bryant and Anders are especially valued for helping companies understand and navigate regulatory human factors, guiding companies of all sizes through submissions to United States Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, and European Union Medical Device Regulations, MDR. Without further ado, let me hand it over to our presenters, Bryant Foster and Anders Orn.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks for the introduction. We're really excited to be here with you today. We've given some good thought to this, and just want to thank Greenlight Guru for hosting these sessions, our session and others. We found Greenlight Guru a few years ago now, and John Spear with the podcast, and I just found so much value in that. So I made it a goal of mine to meet John and kind of hunted him down at one of the conferences one year, and we got to talking, and just super knowledgeable, seemed great to work with, and was open to hosting us through webinars and podcasts we've done with them now. So really appreciate it, and everyone at Greenlight is just awesome. So great working with you guys, and appreciate the opportunity. So as Laura mentioned, Anders and I are human factors usability engineers. We specialize in this work. We love this work. Both of us went to school specifically to help design products to meet the needs of people. So we're interested in making the world kind of a better place through the design, and specifically medical devices. And when I say medical devices, as you can see here, we have experience with a wide range of devices that are regulated. You know, of course, medical devices of all types, combination products, in vitro diagnostics. And so we have a lot of experience working with companies making these types of products, and then also working with the regulators who are deciding whether these products are designed well enough to be marketed in their jurisdiction. And so Anders and I, we talked about what would be valuable, right? Like what is valuable when it comes to human factors and usability engineering to a broad range of individuals, right? Some who have a lot of experience doing this type of work, some who have heard about it and know that eventually they're going to have to guide their company or their product through it, and anywhere in between. And so what we want to do in this is kind of provide for you what we have had to do ourselves, because we found ourselves over the years trying to figure out, okay, especially as these guidance documents and these regulations from various countries and various governing bodies have come about, it has been a bit of an evolution, and we're always trying to stay at the forefront of our understanding of what is required. And so kind of going through this process has been valuable for us, and so we wanted to share it with you. We're really excited about kind of the end of this presentation, where we provide a checklist that will describe kind of, depending on the market you're going for, what do you need to know, what do you need to provide for that particular market. And that's something that we use ourselves, so we're excited to share it with you. So today, the first things we're going to talk about, I really want to drive home the definitions around human factors and usability engineering so that we're all on the same page. Next, we'll talk about kind of who should apply or employ human factors engineering, and then provide an overview of the human factors process, and talk about then specifically what you need to do depending on the market in which you will be selling your product. And then lastly, the reports and the kind of documentation that you need to provide for the different markets. And then lastly, we're excited to get some questions from all of you.
And yeah, so I think I'm going to go slightly out of order for the agenda that you just saw, but I think it's important to start with who should be doing this and who should care about human factors engineering. So really, what it comes down to is risk. So if the result of a use error, and we're going to talk about the definition of use error in a second, could result in harm to the patient or user, you should employ human factors engineering and/or usability engineering. So really, if someone can get hurt when they're using it, whether it's a patient or a doctor who's using it or a nurse, this is human factors engineering is designed to be a way to mitigate risks, right? So everything comes back down to risk, everything comes back down to safety. So today, what we're going to be focusing on is three of the kind of main markets that we're familiar with, really focusing on the West here. We're going to be focusing on the United States, EU, and the UK. And there are regulations that say, hey, you need to be focusing on ways to mitigate risk, like I said. So we have regulations there. MDR is a huge one. It's a really buzzy topic right now, especially having come into effect this year. And then there are guidance documents that kind of tell you how to do that, right? So we have an FDA guidance, and then EU MDR. They refer to the international standard 62366-1, and then there's a technical report 62366-2 that goes into a little more detail. And then of course there's a UK human factors and usability engineering guidance as well, similar to FDA. Now, we have China, South Korea, Australia, Canada down there. We're not going to discuss them in detail, but the general gist that we'd like to give to you is that if you look at the international standard, that's such a great start. Most of these guidances are harmonized, FDA 62366, and then Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, MHRA, in UK. So really focusing on that international standard should get you a long way in submitting to a market outside of these three.
All right, so as discussed, we're going to kind of dig in and just define what these different topics and terms that we're going to use from the start. So human factors and usability engineering mean the same thing. In some countries or areas, they might use human factors more, others they might do usability engineering. So what we find is that often they'll use both. And so for example, the FDA guidance is the human factors and usability engineering guidance. So we'll just call them both, but that is the practice of applying these principles related to human behavior, abilities and limitations, and designing products to meet the abilities and limitations of those users. So if you will, it's the field. Next, we have usability testing. So there's usability engineering, which is the field, and usability testing is a specific method that we use. There's actually all sorts of methods that we use to do research, what sometimes you hear called user research, sometimes called user testing, but really it's putting product in front of people and seeing how they respond to it, right? Do they do what we expect them to do? Do they use it in the way that we have designed it to be used, or do they do different things? And for those of you who have experience doing usability testing, you know that often they do different things because for whatever reason, maybe their mental model is a bit different. What they expect what the product to do is different. Maybe they don't read the instructions that you spent time designing for them. And so the goal of the usability testing is to identify what in the product allowed them to do it incorrectly, if you will, or not in the way that we expected, and how could we design it better in it to ensure that they do use it as we intend. There's two types of usability studies, and well, there's a few types, but the main ones in medical device would be formative research or formative studies, and then validation or summative usability testing. So I'll talk about formative first, even though it's not on the screen here. Formative studies are the studies that you do as you're designing the product. They are checkpoints along the way to ensure by putting the device in its prototype form or whatever form it's in front of the users and allowing them to use it. It's a way to see, are we designing the product appropriately? Is it meeting their needs? Are they doing what we expect with it? And then continue to iterate on the design. And then summative testing has two different terms because depending on the guidance document, so FDA uses validation usability testing and 62366 uses summative usability testing, but they mean the same thing. It's that final exam that is where you take the product in its final form, you give it to users, and you obtain that objective evidence that they can use it safely and effectively. A critical task is a task which, if performed incorrectly or not at all, would or could cause serious harm to the patient or user. And this is consistent amongst all of the governing documents. And so a critical task would be, right, if someone needs to perform an injection and they need to be able to deliver medication, well, we want to make sure that our product that people can actually do that critical task with our product without doing it incorrectly, maybe not getting the medication or potentially doing something wrong that would hurt them.
Brent, what can you say about harm versus serious harm in the United States?
Yeah, so in the US, there's CDRH, the Center for Device and Radiological Health, that governs devices, and there's CDER that governs pharmaceuticals. So combination products would fall under that. And then there's a guidance from CDER as well for human factors that omits the term serious here. So they would say anything that could lead to harm as opposed to serious. And serious, of course, is an objective term. It's many of our discussions that we have with groups we're working with are about, okay, well, of these harms, which ones are serious, right? And so I think it's really up to the company, the sponsor, to determine what that harm level is, and then ultimately present that to the agency that they're submitting to, and that agency will decide if they've encompassed serious harm or harm well enough to to be acceptable. Next, I think it's the last one, we have use error. And I think it's important to note here the lack of the R on the word use. So we don't call things user errors, because the first rule, and I guess the first commandment of human factors and usability engineering is thou shalt not blame thy user. So we attribute errors to the design of the product rather than the users themselves. We know users are flawed. We know humans, we all have imperfect memories and we're limited in what we can do. And so we expect users to make mistakes. What we're trying to do is make a device that is resilient to these differences in people and these errors that they could make. And so a use error is simply when someone does something, and I mean, it's fair to call it a mistake. It's something we don't want them to do based on the way we've designed the product. But the term that these documents use is use error. And those are the things that when we do these usability studies, we really focus on what the use errors were, what did people do that we didn't expect, and is there some element of our design that we could improve to reduce the number of these use errors.
All right, so with those definitions out of the way, we'd like to kind of go through the kind of core human factors process. So I come up with this graphic here that we're going to come back to a couple of times, and it kind of takes it picks and chooses a little bit from FDA guidance 62366 and MHRA's guidance, but everything is very much consistent with one another. So we're going to talk about the human factors process, what we recommend. You'll note that we are using the term validation testing since we are in the United States. That's the term that we are most accustomed to using. But please keep in mind that we can substitute that for summative testing if we need, throughout the talk here. So we're going to talk about the human factors process. We have step one, identify. We're talking about device users, use environment, user interfaces, known issues, and critical tasks. We want to be evaluating, hey, who's going to be using this product? Where is the product going to be used? You're really defining what the user interface is going to be. That might be training, that might be the instructions for use, and then identifying sources of risk to the user or to the patient. And sometimes the user and the patient are the same person. And then we're going to be updating the use-related risk analysis throughout this entire process. And then we'll talk about step two, which is kind of the formative research and design process. Where we're really identifying research questions. What do we want to know? We're conducting formative research, and we're identifying further use-related errors that we may not have anticipated before. And then in that last step that we have here, validation testing or summative usability testing, that's that kind of final exam that Brian alluded to. This is where we're putting the medical device to the test, having representative users come in, use the device, and ensuring that we can, ensuring that the device can be used safely.
Yeah, I think, and we're going to, as Andrew said, talk about each one of these in detail, but I think the big take-home message from all of this is that these documents are continuing to evolve. We talked about some of the additional countries that are releasing documents. MHRA in the UK released their guidance document within the last year. And so these things are continuing to come out, but the take-home message is the process is the process, right? It's not unique, it's not different. What they might have is different terms they use, the way you document it might be differently, the type of report you give them might be different, but the process is the same. It's a human-centered design process, and so that's what this infographic kind of boils down, and it shows that it doesn't need to be a 50-page document to describe how to do it. It really is these steps that can be done, should be done early on and throughout the process.
Yep.
My apologies if I could interrupt. Anders, when you're speaking, would you mind moving the microphone a little bit closer? It seems to be there's a little bit of audio coming from it. Bryant, you sound okay, but the audio, Anders, when you're talking, if you wouldn't mind being a little closer.
I'll move a little closer. Is this any better?
Maybe a little bit closer.
How about this?
Much better. Thank you.
Okay. So, yeah, so we're going to kind of define this process here and what our recommendations are. And then keep in mind that after this, we're going to discuss the differences, the things that are unique about the FDA guidance, the MHRA guidance 62366 for the international standard. So the first thing we're going to be doing here is this identify step, right? So the first thing we want to discuss when we are early in the design process, the development process for the medical device is who is going to use this. Is it a patient? Is it a qualified healthcare professional? And then considering the characteristics of those people, right? There's a huge difference between lay people who might use it at home, and there's those physicians or surgeons or something who would use it at their own facilities, right? So all of these things impact use of the device. So we want to be considering all sorts of facets of use. Who purchases it, receives the device, someone's unpacking it, someone's setting it up, and maybe they're building something, they're building a kiosk or a cart, who is cleaning or reprocessing the device or disposing of it. These might be all completely different people outside of the traditional idea of using the device, right? And again, with characteristics, what is their level of training or education? Might they have any kind of physical or cognitive abilities or limitations that you need to consider? For example, the elderly, a lot of medical devices are going to be intended to be used, or most of the time used by folks who are in their 60s and 70s and 80s, and their sight is poorer at that time. Their hands are just not as nimble as they used to be. So we need to be able to create a device that is usable for those intended users. Also thinking about their emotional state, in the moment, if someone's stressed out, or if they're calm, if they're tired, those are things that we need to be considering at the very beginning of the process so that you can tailor the development of the device. And so we think it's very important to consider the objective of each step, right? So we see these things in the guidance documents for here's what you should do, but so often we find that some people are kind of just going through the motions, and they're kind of doing this because it's a checklist. And so let's always keep in mind there's an objective behind each of these things. So for identifying device users, we are seeking to identify the abilities, the limitations of device's users so that the device can be designed for those users. Then we're going to look at the use environments, right? So this is very similar. We want to consider any aspect of the use environment that could impact the device's use. Is it at home, or is it in a clinical environment like a hospital? What are the distractions like, right? At home, there might be televisions on, there might be a screaming baby, there might be nobody, you might live at home, but it's super variable, right? So you need to be able to account for a lot of quiet and a lot of disruptions. Similarly, at a hospital, there's a lot of stuff going on. There's people running around taking care of people. There's people running around cleaning things. There are lighting considerations to keep in mind when creating a medical device. Noises, temperature, cleanliness, how much space is there? What's the floor made out of? Is it carpet? Is someone going to trip on the carpet? And it's going to be difficult to roll something, or is it tile and it's easily cleaned? So these are things that we want to consider. And again, the objective, right? Identify the characteristics of the use environment that could impact the safety, the effectiveness, and the usability of this device.
I think something, as Andrew said, these objectives, we want to remind us why we're doing this, because so often what we see is we get brought in towards the end as a consultant to help set up or run a validation study. And the first questions we'll ask is, well, who are your users? Where do they use the device? What tasks are they completing? And we want to know those things because that's important for us in terms of designing the usability study. And we find a lot of times these things are known. There's like a general understanding of who uses the product, but it hasn't necessarily always been documented or researched or very well defined. And so the ideal situation would be knowing who's going to use the product, documenting that, so that you can use that information to make design decisions, and also know at some point when it comes time to submit, you're going to have these things documented at that point. And so the ideal situation is do it early, but along the way, at some point, it's going to have to be done. So it's both useful, and that's what the objective is, that it could be useful for you, but also know all of these regulatory agencies are going to ask that you have this documented.
Right. And doing it early is super important, but that's not to say that it needs to be finalized early, right? Like
Sure.
these are living, breathing processes, right? So if something ends up changing, that's okay. But certainly you want to consider these things. Is it great? Is it efficient if you can finalize those decisions early on? Sure, but sometimes you just don't know. You haven't gotten there yet. Okay, so continuing with this idea of identifying, right? Let's identify the device user interface. So this is anything, a user interface is anything that the user sees, touches, hears, smells, or otherwise interacts with. And a lot of people are surprised to realize that it's more than just the device, right? There's labeling. This thing might come in a box. There's buttons, there's screens, the labeling and the instructions for use. These are all part of the user interface. And we'll talk about, with validation or summative usability testing, all of these things are going to be under evaluation to determine if they can be used effectively and safely. Another one that a lot of people kind of don't realize or overlook is training. Training is part of the user interface. And it's just kind of beyond that traditional idea of a physical thing that you'd be looking at. But a training, whether it's a presentation, a slide deck, a video, or an in-person training, whether that's individualized or a group training, that's part of the user interface. And so considering this really helps you to really start thinking about the risks, right? So identifying the characteristics of the user interface that could impact the safety, effectiveness, and usability of the device. And this really sets us up nicely for kind of the next few phases of identify, which is talking about risk, right? So one of the great things that you can do to identify risk for a medical device is identifying known use issues. Someone might know about these things. So you can do primary research and you can do secondary research. So first, go find out for yourself. You could interview device users of the device that's a previous version of the device that you have, or it's a similar device or a predicate device in the United States. You can interview those device users. You could observe them. Maybe there's an ethnographic research study that you perform to learn more about the known issues. Or you can interview with trainers. Trainers who teach users to how to use the device are going to be great resources for knowing kind of the common issues, right? Then there's secondary research, which is going to be probably a little bit less labor intensive, right? You're not conducting an actual study, but there is literature out there. There are internal complaint logs for a previous version of your device in your own organization that, ideally you're collecting complaints, you're collecting data of how things are being used once they're on the market. Review those, see how things are going. And then databases, these are, this is going to be kind of the most common thing that folks do, is reviewing databases in the respective market to identify use-related issues or risks that have happened in the past. In the United States, the FDA guidance has a whole section here, identification of use-related problems, and they give several resources of places that you can go to find information about known issues. The MAUDE database is super common. And then the 62366 guidance, actually, the technical report part 2 gives all sorts of resources as well for several countries, not just the United States, but United Kingdom is mentioned. I see Sweden, Switzerland, Germany. So checking those things out in the respective country where it might be used can be super helpful for identifying known use issues. And the whole goal of this, right, let's not forget the objective and not just go through the motions, learn from the mistakes of the previous versions of the device or similar devices from other manufacturers. We want to figure out what's gone wrong before so we don't do it ourselves.
Yeah, and of course there's value in that in and of itself to make a product better, but that is what these regulatory agencies are going to be looking at is, have you done your due diligence to learn about the other products like yours, the issues that have occurred related to use, and have you make sure to design those things out of your product, or as, I guess as best you can. All right, so now identification of the critical tasks. I defined critical tasks early on, and those again are the tasks that, if performed incorrectly or not at all, could lead to harm. And so in any device, any type of product, there is a list of tasks. Everything from unboxing it, to turning it on, to using it the first time, powering it down, putting it away, storing it. All of these are tasks that users have to complete. And the first step in identifying those tasks that could lead to harm is to identify all of the tasks and list them out. So you can see in our example table here, this is an example, a snippet of a use-related risk analysis. So defining where use-related risk could occur. And it starts with the device task. And we're going to list all of these tasks. There might be 100 tasks, and then methodically move through to determine where the risk could occur. So if we go to the next, so as you can see in the table on the left, we have an example of remove the needle protector. And we've said that, okay, when people remove the needle protector, they may encounter an accidental needle stick, they could contaminate the needle, or they could damage the needle. And these, this is just an example. There could be many more. These might not be the best, but those are the potential ones we've listed right now. And then each of those use-related risks is going to have a potential harm, and that will come from our risk analysis. Every device will have a risk analysis to define all of the risks that could happen with this product, from everything from manufacturing to shipping to whatever it may be, to storage. And so the risk analysis should also include any harm that could occur from use or misuse. And that's where we would pull in these use-related harms. And for each of these as well, there will be, for each harm, there will be a severity of harm. And the severity for these that we've assigned, again, kind of for our example, would be on maybe a 5-point scale. We've got 3s, 2s, the 3 would be serious, 2 would be marginal. And then it's important to know that when assigning what would be critical, we set a threshold. And so that threshold for this particular product might be a 3 and above on the severity scale. Those are our critical tasks. I think it's important to note that although the qualitative term that is given to that severity, so for example, here we use serious, we see a lot of severity scales that use critical or any number of things they say, and I think that can cause us confusion a lot of times because the term critical task might also be in the severity table. And so it's important to know that critical task, regardless of whatever our scale is, if we look at the harm that could occur, we need to say, is that a harm that we would consider serious enough that would be causing harm to the patient or user, and that would then be a critical task. So it could be, for example, if a 2 was actually, the 2 for pain here, if that actually was what we consider to be harm, that could also be a critical task. But for our example, we're saying the 3s and above are critical. One more thing to note is you notice we do not list or describe anything about probability, and we don't talk about the risk score. So the risk score or value is a combination of severity and probability, but all of the guidance documents for human factors describe that determining your critical tasks only depends on the severity of potential harm, and does not take into account the probability. So no matter how remote, if there is a serious harm, then that would be considered a critical task. The objective of this, again, is to find out where our use-related risk could occur. And what this analysis does is it helps us identify the tasks that need to be evaluated through the final validation or summative usability study. So we'll talk about this in greater detail and some of the differences between the agencies, or the markets, but the critical tasks are ultimately those that are most important because, again, what we're trying to show is the device can be used safely. And so most importantly, we want to know that users, or demonstrate that users can perform these safety critical tasks. Back to our graphic. So we've gone through and listed and talked about everything in that step 1 identify step. Now we're going to move into step 2, which is the research and design. And the most important thing to know here is here we are actually designing products. So in terms of timing, right, ideally we would do a lot of identification up front, but of course we're not going to know exactly what the critical tasks are if we don't have a designed product. We might know that users are going to need to turn on the device, they're going to need to perform an injection or whatever it may be, but we don't know exactly how those things are going to be carried out until we actually have a product. So as Anders mentioned, these documents should live, they should continue to evolve as the product is designed. So in this step 2, we're going to design product and then along the way evaluate the usability of it to make sure that it is indeed usable and we're not having issues that we potentially could learn about and design out. So a few characteristics of formative usability research. We want to evaluate as much as we can of the user interface along the way. So this might be, one example would be if we have a device that has software and hardware, it might be a lot faster. We can maybe prototype the software faster than we can the hardware. And so it might make sense to prototype the software and have people perform tasks within the software long before we even have a hardware prototype that we have them interact with. And by doing that, we can move quickly and evaluate certain things, make sure our software user interface is usable, to make changes there, and eventually marry the two together and have studies that have software and hardware together. But I think the idea is just to, as quickly as possible, get these studies into people to find out if they're usable, if we're designing the right product. And yeah, a couple things, these formative studies are usually fairly small in terms of studies. So we got 5 to 7 people, as few as 5 to 7 people in a study. That will give us information about what works and what doesn't, what's usable and what's not. And our goal with these is to learn as much as we can.
And I think it's sometimes people ask us kind of what's the difference between the strategies in a formative usability study and a validation or summative usability study. And there are several differences, and we're going to talk about validation and summative studies in a moment. But I think the big differences are kind of scope, right? So what it might be that it's the entire interface for the formative, or it could just be parts. Also, the sample size is fewer than the validation or summative study, but also it's this learn everything you can and the way you go about that procedure, right? So the formative research, the formative usability study, you're asking questions along the way. Like that's perfectly appropriate to do to really tackle that topic as you see it and as it's happening in the moment. Whereas in the validation study, you're going to kind of hold off and let them use the device in a simulated use way. And I know we'll talk about that in a second here.
So we put on here, focus on the critical tasks. So if we do know there are tasks that are more critical than others, if you're able to design those first, prototype those first, and find out if they are usable, that can really help, right? Because those are the things that are going to be most important when we get to the end with the validation study. These studies help us build confidence. We can know, Anders and I have been a part of studies where we know the validation study is going to be successful because we've done formative research. Even though when we put people in a usability study, participants, they do weird things, we know that product overall is usable and we're very confident, and the company is very confident. It's like taking a practice test before you take your final exam. If you get good results on the practice, then you could expect good results on the final exam. And it also allows us to perfect or improve the design of the study itself. Designing a usability study that's kind of where we add value, is simulating these tasks and having people do this in a realistic manner. I'm trying to make it as, I guess, realistic as we can. Yeah, as we can. Yep. And so if we do a formative study, we can see, ooh, that question didn't land quite right, or that simulation was kind of weird, people didn't take it seriously. And we don't want to find out that our study design is not ideal when we do in a validation study, right? It's better to learn that in a formative study where there's not so much writing on it. The results aren't going to be submitted off to one of these agencies. So that completes step 2. Formative research, of course, that is now, it's so funny because that probably is the longest step in the design process. We're talking months and years, a lot of times, to design, develop a product, iterate along the way. But as far as the human factors portion is concerned, it's being that point of systematically checking in to make sure the design is moving in the right direction, that people can use it as we intend. So we're on to now validation usability testing.
Yep. Yeah. So here what's the goal of this study, right? The validation or summative usability study. It's to obtain objective evidence that the user interface can be used safely. This is the final exam that we've been talking about, right? So there's some important details that are important to cover with regard to a validation usability study. So first of all, this needs to be the medical device or the user interface needs to be in its complete form, and it needs to be in its final form. You can imagine that if you evaluated the medical device, or let's talk about an IFU, an instructions for use, and you evaluate a draft during the validation study. And you collect data, and that data says that, hey, this can be used really, safely and effectively. This is great. Everyone understood what was going on, and they were able to follow procedures. And then you change the device. You change the IFU. All of a sudden, after making those changes, the data that you collected in that study is totally invalid. It doesn't matter anymore because you have data saying that something that doesn't exist is usable. So you need to make sure that the user interface, the device, the IFU, the training, all of that is in its final form. You also want to have a simulated use environment as much as you can to the most, to whatever's practical, right? So we want to consider, just like in phase 1, where is this device going to be used? Is it going to be used in the dark? Is it going to be used in a hospital? Is it a surgical suite? What types of materials are available to the users? What types of distractions are happening? What are they hearing? And so there's lots of things that we can simulate, right? We can put on ambient noise. We could make the lighting a little bit darker. We could make it really, really bright. So we want to try and make that as realistic as possible without kind of killing ourselves. But it is something that reviewers of submissions are paying attention to. We want to make sure that the training is representative of real world. So this is kind of like making sure that it's in its final form. And making sure that there's a decay period. So a decay period is an opportunity for the participant of the study to forget what they might have learned during the training. And we're going to talk about the details as to what these regulatory bodies recommend for how long the decay period should be. But we want to make sure that training is representative of real world. If it's a group training in the real world and folks are not going to be using the device until a week after their training, then the study should have a group training, and folks shouldn't come back for their evaluation until maybe a week later And there's some wiggle room in some cases, but that's the ideal situation. We need to make sure that all the critical tasks are evaluated, and a lot of times this is simulated use or open-ended comprehension questions. We need to make sure that we're not biasing or hinting to the participants and influencing their behavior. We want this to be as realistic as possible. If they're having trouble and we say, hey, participant, go ahead and use the IFU and let's see if that helps you, that is not appropriate, right? We do not want to give any hints. We need to figure out if this medical device can be used safely and effectively. We're going to be determining the root causes of all use errors, difficulties, and close calls for all tasks, but especially those that are critical, that have safety, use-related risk attached to them. And this helps us really come up with a potential solution, but also to really identify if there's a way, maybe there is a solution, maybe there's not, but also determining if this is acceptable to your organization or not. And then 15 participants per user group. We recommend 15 participants per user group. We're going to talk about some details here with 62366, and they don't necessarily say 15, but we feel that this is a conservative, good way to do it for a validation usability study. I did say user group here. I just want to quickly define that. A user group is a group of participants that are kind of different from one another, or that is different from a different user group because of their characteristics. So for example, an injection device might have two user groups. It might have nurses and doctors. And nurses and doctors are different because they have different training. They have different responsibilities. They have different goals from doctors who have a lot more training. And so because this training and their goals and roles can influence use, they are separate from and we could talk about user groups for an hour straight just on this one topic, but I'll kind of stop it there and we'll keep on going here. So now we want to kind of compare markets. We've talked a lot about the human factors process. As we said before, this is what we recommend. This is kind of the core human factors process, identifying specifically the intended users, use environments, identifying risk, known issues, formative testing, iterating on the design, and then the validation or summative usability tests. Let's see how, what's unique about these markets outside of this process. So let's focus on the activities or topics in this identify phase. And we have FDA guidance, we have 62366-1 and the technical report -2 and the MHRA guidance, okay? So this first one, identify intended users. What we described is perfectly fine for all three of these regulatory bodies. Identifying intended uses, intended use environments, defining training. What we described, you're good to go for all three of these bodies.
So they all three want you to define them and document them.
That's right. Okay. Now, in terms of documentation, we have kind of a weird one here. There's a document called a use specification. And this is basically, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor here, but these first 4 rows, we're identifying things, intended users, uses, use environments, training. That can all be accumulated in a specific document, which would be a use specification document. A lot of people call these use specs. 62366 and MHRA specifically mention a use spec. FDA does not, so FDA would like you to do this. This is a perfectly acceptable thing to do. It's a good thing to do. The only thing we're saying here is that the guidance does not mention anything about a specific use specification document. That's all we're saying. Okay, and we'll keep going here in this identify phase. Here's an activity, describe the user interface, including technical requirements. So there's kind of 2 things here, right? There's describing the user interface, and then technical requirements are things that you define that are requirements for your user interface. So you might say, based on previous literature, that it is required that this that the graphical user, the screen has a contrast ratio of this, or you might say that the force required to depress the plunger of this injection device is exactly this, or at least this. And this allows you to have specific kind of design requirements that are set up to allow users of whoever the intended user is to use it effectively. So MHRA, well, we'll get to MHRA. FDA guidance doesn't talk about technical requirements at all. They don't have any kind of requirement there in their guidance document. They do want to have a description of the user interface. Now, 62366 is the exact opposite. They don't mention a description of the user interface, only technical requirements. Now, having said this, if we talked about a use spec, a use specification document that FDA doesn't really talk about, here we have a user interface specification document. And so 62366 and MHRA, they do want to have that, but FDA guidance doesn't say anything about having a UI spec, even though they do want you to document.
And the user interface spec would say something like the device should be, the device shall be designed to have this sort of contrast ratio, and it will be no more than 10 pounds.
Sure.
So kind of design how it's going to be designed.
Right. So then we have identified known use issues. We talked about primary research and secondary research. That process is consistent between the three. Identifying use-related hazards, defining critical tasks. All these things are the same. Now, I will say with critical tasks, until recent, well, 62366 does not have the term critical task in its definitions list. However, recently, I think it was this year, there was an update to 62366 where they kind of slipped in a mention of a critical task. They didn't add it to the definitions list, they just kind of slipped it in there. And that suggests to us that they at least recognize the term, right? So here, we're kind of saying that, you know, the idea of a critical task is perfectly fine for all three.
And I think if you were submitting something to align with 62366, as long as you defined what a critical task was in whatever report you're giving and saying these critical tasks are related to safety, and then they would obviously know what you're talking about.
Exactly. Yep. So going over to this next phase of formative research, right? We have create a user interface evaluation plan. And for me, this is like, there's a theme developing, right? Where 62366 and MHRA, they want a specific document that documents this process, whereas the FDA guidance doesn't really have anything there. They want you to do it, you know, they want you to plan, you know, how you're going to evaluate the user interface through formative studies, who's involved in the formative studies, how many people will there be, what part of the user interface are you evaluating, and all the way through the process of validation / summative testing, and how many people there will be, who the user groups are, maybe there's you know, ethics considerations and all that stuff. Here, this row, I want to be clear that we're talking about a sample of an example of a protocol. In order to have a formative usability study or a summative or a validation usability study, you need to create a study protocol. It identifies who's going to be in the study, what will be covered, the goals of the study. And so that's kind of a built-in mandatory thing in order to conduct a study. Here in this row, 62366 provides an example protocol, whereas FDA and MHRA do not provide a sample. So don't go looking to those guidance documents for an example. 62366 is the one to go to. Okay, so then we have conduct formative evaluations. All three want you to do that. However, it's important to note this is not required. You do not need to do formative usability evaluations, but we absolutely do not think you should do that and skip this step altogether. A lot of people try to kind of gloss over this and save time and resources, but it's just so worth it to get practice going through the protocol, to identify sources of use-related risk and mitigate them before that final exam. And then revise use-related issues. This is kind of going off what I was just saying. All three of these guidance documents want you to revise use-related problems as you discover them during the formative research and design process. Okay, now we're getting into validation study. You want me to go or should I go? Okay, so the first row here is everybody, FDA 62366, MHRA. They want you to do a validation summative usability study. You need to have this formal evaluation to determine that, or to demonstrate that the user interface can be used safely. Simulated use environment. All three want to have as realistic as you can, but within reason. We want to be including representative users. So you don't, if the intended users of the device are nurses and doctors, we're not going to bring in lay users to use the device for the validation study. Sample size. So I mentioned this a little bit before. FDA guidance and MHRA, they commit to, or they specifically mention a 15 participant per user group requirement. You can justify, depending on the situation, you can make justifications as to whether you need fewer or more than 15 for all three, but FDA guidance and MHRA guidance specifically say 15. 62366 does not really commit to a specific requirement. However, in the technical report, part 2, they do kind of allude to this idea that 15 may be sufficient. They specifically talk about an example with 15 users per user group. And for us, that suggests to us that, no one is going, unless there's a completely good reason to have more, no one's gonna cry foul if you have 15 users. If anything, you might be able to justify having fewer.
Yeah, I think we've seen studies with fewer participants in studies for MDR for 62366. But one of the things that occurs to me is it's a minimum, right? So some devices, for example, if the population is very diverse, like used by general population, over-the-counter product, you may get asked to do more participants, or you may be proactive and say, we're going to include more participants in this because we know it's a very diverse population. Right. And all that 15 does is every time you add a participant to a study, you're more likely to uncover usability issues. And 15 is the number that is decided right now, but there's already talks of it changing, so it may change one day.
Yep. Okay, one more table here. So we're still on the topic of validation studies, summative studies. So we've already talked about finalized design. We do not want to have any part of the user interface be non-final, and that's for all three. Here's an interesting one. Instructions for use. So FDA guidance and 62366, they kind of operate under the assumption that if you just include the IFU in the study, you're evaluating the entire user interface, which includes the IFU. So you're kind of getting data where you validated the IFU by just going through a traditional usability study. MHRA wants you to have a specific study evaluating the IFU in addition to the validation, the traditional validation or summative study. So that's a big difference, right? That would probably look that looks like kind of the difference between having a study where you're validating the IFU versus a traditional usability study is telling the participant to use the IFU, instructing them to follow the procedures in that document. That helps you validate the document. Whereas a traditional study, you're not instructing them to use it. They're free to use it, but they're not instructed to use it. Training decay period of at least 1 hour. FDA guidance and MHRA suggest that a minimum decay period for training is 1 hour, whereas 62366 does not specify a minimum training decay period, excuse me. they just say that you should probably have one. So that's just a kind of small difference in that document. Then evaluating residual risk after the validation or summative study. This is something that we have not talked about yet, and we're just kind of going to gloss over it here. But the idea of residual risk is after going through the final exam, the validation or summative study, you should have objective data suggesting that the device can be used safely. But there might be times where you can't, and there's residual risk remaining. That might be where you get data that says, hey, this task had a few use errors. People had trouble with this, but as an organization, you cannot come up with a way to further mitigate that risk. And that's just, it is what it is. We can't do any better. There's going to be residual risk. We did the best we could. That's one source of residual risk. And so all of these different sources of residual risk, you need to be able to have justification as to why that's acceptable and what you've done to do everything you can to mitigate risk.
Yeah. Ultimately, what any reviewer is looking at is, does the benefit outweigh the risk? And so we so often get asked, what is the success criteria, or what would make our validation study unsuccessful? And unfortunately, it's impossible to say that before the study. A task that is very safety critical, or that could lead to great harm, if you had one use error on that task, it could require you to change the design and run another study to validate the new design. And others, you could have 3, 4, or 5 errors on that task out of the 15 participants, and you could look at it. You kind of tell the agency, okay, what happened and where the design is to blame for it, and you could have a justification for why the design will stay that way, and your analysis of, or I guess rationale as to why that is still a beneficial thing to have, and why the benefit outweighs that risk.
Sure. And then this last one is also something that we have not discussed, but it's very important. And even though it's important, we're going to gloss over it. But the idea is post-market surveillance. Once the device is on the market, keep collecting data, keep finding out if people are using this effectively and safely. Don't just kind of throw it out there, for people to just kind of use and not collect data. The difference here in the documents is that while FDA certainly wants you to do this, they don't mention post-market surveillance in the guidance, whereas 62366 and MHRA do.
Yeah, of course, there are other documents that talk about post-market surveillance, but not the human factors guidance for FDA.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so we're not going to go into detail about the reports here, but we can kind of compare the markets further with FDA versus 62366 versus MHRA. Now with FDA, you're really looking at a report, and there's this kind of the final deliverable where you're summarizing what you did up until that validation study and including the validation study. So you can see in section 2, intended users, uses, use environments. You can see summary of known use problems. This is all stuff we've been talking about. So this is a summary report of all of those activities. 62366, they are kind of, the final deliverable there is really more of a file, right? And each of these items here in this list are their own documents. And of course, you're going to have the final summative evaluation test report included in this file. But this is kind of the more of the deliverable that you're looking at. MHRA is very similar to FDA, where you have a summary of the human factors activities that you've engaged in. Now, I want to be clear, just because we're saying here that MHRA and FDA guidance are just a report, and then 62366 is a file. All three of them, there's a file. And you're documenting all of these activities in this file. And then at the end, there's a report that documents kind of how that process went, what's included in that process, and how that validation or summative study went, the results of it. And so we just have these in our slides. They're straight from the guidance documents. They're here for you to, as a resource, if you feel free to if you want to review them later on. So just a couple of quick conclusions here, right? The human factors process is largely the same regardless of the market. We just spent about 20 minutes talking about the differences between the 3 regulatory agencies that are within scope of this presentation, but really those are not big differences. I'd say the biggest difference is that IFU requirement for MHRA and versus FDA and 62366. It's just kind of small little tweaks. So if you follow this human factors process we've been talking about, you're good. When it comes to documentation and language and the kind of the final report, go ahead and check out that guidance document, get the specifics for what you need, but this process, as we've been kind of saying, is what you need to do. Now, if you are just in doubt and you want to just pick one of these to follow, maybe you're going to be, you don't know where you're going to go, or you hope to go somewhere 5 years down the line and you're just not really sure what to do, just use the international standard 62366-1 and the technical report 62366-2. It's for sure your safest bet. It is fully officially recognized and harmonized with FDA's guidance and MHRA's guidance. You can't go wrong with just following this if you want to make a choice.
Yeah, I think that was one of the biggest things we were thinking of is, how many markets do we cover, right? Because every year, more and more markets have their own guidance document. But as we said throughout, they all, most of them cite 62366, whether they follow it word for word or they're actually making their own guidance document. That's why, we recommend 62366. And, for example, China has its own guidance document now. And one of the big things there, and something we didn't talk about, but for China, you would have to do your study in the Chinese market. And FDA, they're very specific there too. If you do a study for an FDA approval, you would need to do your study in the US, whereas for 62366, if you're going to be releasing your product or going for a CE mark, you can have data collected in the US, for example, and submit that for CE marking. So yeah, as we said, the process is the same, but if you know you're going to a specific market, go and see if there's a guidance for that market. For example, South Korea, they just have a new guidance document as of this year. And so these things are coming about more and more. Although they don't say anything new or different or groundbreaking, they might just have some specifics for their particular market.
Right. And Canada literally just took 62366 and then put CAN in front of it. So
yeah, I agree with that too.
So just quickly, we're nearly done here. We're over time, but a couple of resources. These are the guidance documents and just important human factors related documents and papers that we use frequently. And then just very, very quickly, Research Collective, a few of the Research Collective folks wrote a book about human factors. We do have, we'd like to do 25 free copies to the first 25 people who would like one. Shoot an email to book@research-collective.com. We'd love to send you one. And if you feel like it would be helpful, certainly reach out. So that's the presentation. Sorry, we went a little bit long, but we'd love to get any questions that you all have, and we will answer them to the best of our ability.
Sounds great. Thank you both so much. That was a wonderful presentation. I know I certainly learned a lot, along with many of our participants with us today. We have had over 400 participants, so we've had quite a few questions come in, so we will try to get to as many as we can for our last about 20 minutes here. So if you're ready, I will go ahead with our first question here. So we had quite a few different participants ask a question regarding the sample size of 15 users. I know you did touch on that as a requirement from MHRA and the FDA. Would you have any recommendations on kind of where somebody should start when they're starting to look at their sample size requirements for a human factors study?
Yeah, I would start with that 15, really. Yeah. I would say that is a pretty tried and true number. And then, as we mentioned, if if you have a population that is very small, if you make a product for patients with hemophilia, for example, that's a very small market, then you might say, have an argument to reduce the sample size and say getting 15 participants is just not realistic. If we can get 7, we would feel very fortunate. And so that might be one way of thinking about maybe having a smaller sample size. And then, as we mentioned, with a large, diverse population, like a lay user population, over-the-counter product, you may say, look, it's 15 people. It's like that just doesn't really represent the market very well at all. We would maybe suggest going to 20 participants or 25. Even that falls short, but at least it shows to any reviewers that you're aware that you're trying to represent a diverse population, and so you're kind of within reason increasing the sample size to have more variation in your sample.
Right. And what we've seen people do too, especially with this example of like a lay user study, what we've seen people do is create new user groups, and this is maybe on one end of the spectrum in terms of how conservative you're being, but we've seen people create a whole new user group for people with low health literacy. And we've seen people have an entire, so that's 15 people right there. We've seen 15 people for English as a second language in the United States. We've seen people do age as a bracket, right? So maybe there's children from 10 to 18 as a user group, and then young adults or kind of middle-aged adults, 18 to 45, and then 45 and up. It really just depends on the characteristic and how much it affects use and safety. So like I said, that's a pretty conservative approach, but it could be done, but we definitely would go with 15 to start.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I'm going to continue along in our questions here so we can get to as many as we can. I will go ahead and give out the reminder that the copy of this presentation and the slides will be made available to you later today. If you look out for your email, I've gotten that question come in a couple times. So yes, you will have the availability for the slides. We have had a couple people as well wondering if you could flash back to the screen about the book so that they could see that title and that email address again. Perfect. Thank you very much. Our next question going along here is, at what point in the design and development process would you start applying human factors activities?
Well, at the very beginning.
As early as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, if we were thinking about, I don't know, making a plan or going on a trip, right? You would start by thinking about, okay, well, where are the places that we want to go? And okay, what do we need to have to get there? How are we going to get there? Where are we going to stay? You wouldn't just get in your car and start driving and then end up where you want to. I guess some people would do that. And Anders would do that.
You need to know what to pack, right? You wouldn't, if you're designing the product.
There you go. Yeah. Are we going to go to a cold climate?
Right.
Heaven forbid, us being from Arizona, we wouldn't know what to pack. But yeah, I think so. Having that plan, right? That's where we started with that step one, that identifying who's going to use the product, what are their characteristics, where are they using it? Is this something they're using when they go to bed? Is it some sort of sleep monitor? And now they're using it. What is the environment like there? It's probably not a bright lit room in the middle of the day. And so just really early thinking through those things. And then when it comes to actually evaluating what you're designing, I mean, really, when we talk to people, really no matter where they are in the design process, our recommendation almost always is, let's get this in front of users. Let's get a real study underway where we can actually see and basically show you what people do with your product. I think a lot of times it's so easy to spend a lot of time, a lot of good energy, a lot of good meetings to design a product, but the rubber hits the road when you put it in the hands of a user, and then the company, the group that's designing it, gets to see what they actually do, and it's like this light bulb. Everyone goes, "Oh man, we would have never expected them to think that, or to do that, to place it there." And so I think, yeah, as early as you can, even if it's a rough kind of design and you're putting it in front of people and getting their feedback, that is going to move you in the right direction.
And we say this, obviously, as human factors professionals, we are naturally going to promote this process, right? But it's also, it's good practice, right? Like human-centered design as an idea, it helps you to, when you get data and feedback from actual users early on, and you find out that there's a tweak that needs to be made, or even especially a major change, it's so much easier to make that change early on in the design process. If you completely exclude formative studies and getting user feedback, and you find out that something's wrong, 9 times out of 10, people are like, sorry, the design is frozen, we can't do this, there's nothing we can do. And so it's like, well, what was the point of that formative study? If you're not willing to change anything, why'd you do it? So it's just so much easier to make changes and really shape the product as you go by employing this process. And it feels like you're spending resources that you shouldn't or that you don't need to, but in the long run, it truly is an investment and it pays off.
Absolutely. I would definitely agree with you in the fact that the earliest you can start thinking about it and planning for it, the better off you're going to be in the long run. Wonderful, thank you. So I have had a couple questions come in all around the same topics, so I'm going to summarize them into one larger question for you here. And so we have had quite a few participants ask about some of the key differences, but also the similarities that you might see in human factors engineering for a medical device, a combination product, and a software SAMDA device.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this really is, again, the process that you would follow for any one of those. As we mentioned, if you have a combination product, then you should definitely look at the guidance document that governs combination products put out in the FDA by CDER. And know some of those specifics for that particular review, the people who are going to review it. But again, the process is going to be the same. The type of study you're going to run, a usability study, and evaluating or providing objective evidence that the device can be used safely is going to be the same no matter the product.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Our next question here is looking at or talking about more a novel technology, asking how would you suggest tackling identifying known issues when it's a novel technology with no similar devices on the market?
I would do the best you can. I think sometimes we've worked with some things like that, and I think by going through the exercise, again, we kind of mentioned the due diligence, right? There may be nothing similar enough to compare to. I would argue that often there is something close enough that, or you could put in there, hey, this is not exactly what ours does, but this kind of similar technology has these use-related issues. We've seen that be effective. Yeah, I think we've also seen it where there's nothing quite like that. And it's appropriate to say, we've done our research, we've looked for things that might be use-related issues, and we just don't find them.
Yeah, it's totally fine. You just say, look, there isn't any, there aren't any.
Yeah, and that's that proactive approach, right? Rather than having the reviewers ask you, well, have you looked for known use-related issues? You come right out with it and say, we've done the work. This is where we've looked. We don't identify anything. You're going to be in a good place with them by having been proactive.
Wonderful, thank you both again. Moving along in our questions here. I lost my question there. So this question goes along, is there a need to do all 3 steps of human factors engineering for each release of a product, including maintenance releases?
Maintenance releases.
Well, so first of all, it depends on what the release, what's in the release. So like if it's going to, if the user the use of the device remains pretty much the same, and like the user won't even notice, certainly that does not need any kind of further data, because the user interface remains unchanged. So I'd start with that.
I think a lot of times too is, does this change trigger another submission? So if it does, that would mean it's substantial enough to at least consider whether human factors and usability engineering should be considered. But yeah, I agree with Anders on that. That if the interface itself is not changing and you're changing internal components and the user is none the wiser, then it's probably as simple as, again, being proactive, showing, documenting that you've evaluated it for the changes to usability, and then having a reason for doing usability efforts or not. And I would say if it is changing, and especially if you have a new submission, then it might not require all of that additional work to do the identification of users and environments. I mean, you likely have that, but it would be important to put it all together into a package, right? So some sort of report that brings in these elements of who the users are, where they use it, what are the critical tasks, and if there's new tasks that are safety critical, then having objective evidence through a validation usability study that the people can perform those tasks.
It comes back down to risk again. If it introduces a severe harm or a risk to the patient or user, then certainly. And this is another thing I would say too, is like, this isn't what you want to hear, but like, you should be doing human factors and usability research kind of anyway, whether it's included or whether there's another submission or not. Like this, ideally it's part of your process, and you can kind of bundle it in. The idea is to protect people and make sure that people are using your device safely and effectively, not to check a box.
Thank you there very much. Very nice answer. Our next question that has come in here is asking, what would you say to clients who want to conduct their summative test and clinical trials together?
Don't do it. Okay, so yeah, and I do love this question, and I've spent hours thinking of ways to do these things together. So where I've come to is that it might be impossible to combine a clinical study with a summative usability study. And I'll say that's a validation or summative usability study. I do think clinical trials can be combined, and we've combined definitely clinical trials with formative studies, right? It gives you a chance to learn. There's no rules on these formative studies, and you've got people using the product. Let's take advantage of it. Let's find out if there's any usability issues that we can learn about in that setting. But when it comes to trying to combine a clinical and a summative, the reason I don't think it can be done is that you're trying to answer two different questions. A clinical trial is designed to answer the question, is the device, is the product effective? Does it effectively deliver this therapy or provide this treatment? And in order to do that, you have to ensure that the treatment is administered correctly, which would mean you have some proctoring, maybe the representative from the company is in the room, making sure it's delivered appropriately, because if you have any hiccups in how the device is used or how the therapy is administered, you can no longer compare that data to the rest of it where it was used correctly. And in a summative or a validation usability study, your question is, can people use the device safely? Can they use it without our help? And so in that sense, you can't help them, you can't guide them along the way. And so in order to do that, you have to let the errors happen. And you would not want to have errors in a clinical trial necessarily, if you could harm people. And so that's the reason for a simulated setup in these usability studies, so that we can allow the errors to happen if they do without incurring the harm.
Yeah, I think the only way that I can see it working is if you can if there's a way to let a participant do their thing, let them make their mistakes if they're going to make them, and then correct whatever mistake they might have made before the therapy reaches the patient.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's really hard to do. A lot of people want to do this. It's an attractive idea, but it's hard.
Absolutely. And kind of branching off that question as well, we've gotten a couple questions when it comes to actually doing those tests for an FDA submission. If you have seen any regulations around or had any issues with having those tests completed out of the country, so whether in Canada or another country, do you have any, or have you seen issues pop up along those lines?
We've seen issues. The guidance is clear. They want the study, if it's going for FDA submission, they want the study conducted in the US, or they do open the door for similar markets. Right? It's unclear as to what that means. I would think Canada, you could make a justification that the market is similar enough that if you ran your study there, it would apply. But you don't have a guarantee from the agency in that guidance document, right? You would be then relying on the reviewers to be okay with that as well. Outside, Europe, I think you start to run into some issues there potentially. We've seen studies conducted in Asia that have been flat out rejected because of that, because they say the populations are so different. Anders?
Yeah, certainly the population. Yeah, I think a few things come to my mind. For sure, I mean, in my experience, FDA reviewers are sticklers for this. Like, don't, Canada, I would think would work, but think about like in China and comparing China and the United States, like for the design norms are different. So like, for example, and I don't know what if these two things are actually different here, but in the United States, there's a common thing in a GUI, like a hamburger menu. It's like 3 little lines where a lot of us know it to be a menu, but somewhere else that might not be the norm. Like that's like, what the heck is that? And so these user interfaces are totally different. And so getting data on something in China when the device is set up for China is just not going to carry over to the United States. I also remember one separately where the idea was to use data with technicians in Germany, and they wanted to try and have it here in the United States or apply it to a United States submission. And the training and expertise of the German technicians, I won't go into details, but was just so much better than here in the United States. Like, these guys really knew what they were talking about. They were very professional, and they were kind of very strict on the procedures that they followed at their facility. And just turns out that here in the United States, it's just more lax for this particular thing. And so the users and their experience and their training are completely different, even though they have the same title.
Thank you so much for your insight into some of your experiences when it comes to those different tests. I will say we have about run out of time here, so I just want to say a big thank you to Bryant and Anders, both for myself and all of our participants who joined us for today. It has been a highly informative presentation, and for all your additional insights in the Q&A. Thank you.